Okay, so we're back after a week. We're going to catch up on some stuff we didn't get a chance to talk about last week, including our reactions to the hiring of Jim Schwartz as defensive coordinator and some, I think, things that maybe we've talked about, at least to ourselves, or I've written about a little bit, but may not have been sort of picked up on at large. I think we have something to add to that conversation. The Kevin Stefanski taking our advice, even if he didn't pick necessarily the right outlet to do it on. There were better choices to be had, like this one. He did go on the radio, and again, I continue to believe that he's a really good advocate for himself. And when he talks, I think he does himself very well for communicating what he wants to do and getting people to sort of understand why he does things the way he does, even if there's always going to be a segment of the fan base who's just always going to disagree, and that's fine. The key here is I will always rather hear him say it than have us or people who are biased either for or against try to interpret for him what he's saying. It just makes everything a whole lot easier. And because the media being what it is, and obviously we're sort of part of that, you can get sort of a, disjointed view of who he is, as opposed to him just saying it. It's very cut and dry. We're not trying to interpret for him. It just becomes a much easier process. That we'll still talk about some of the playoff stuff, which has been really interesting. But here we are, Bree. How are we feeling? How we doing? Where are we at?
I'm hanging in there, Pete. So last weekend, I guess 2 weekends ago, I came down with some plantar fasciitis pain. And not to give everyone my complete medical history, but somewhat, I ended up going to a podiatrist to take care of the pain because it had just been kind of consistently sticking around for a couple of months. And so he put me on a steroid, which I'm very, very used to taking steroids, which I don't like, but I did it. It worked. And then 4 days later, I woke up on Tuesday morning feeling very nauseous, and lo and behold, the stomach bug hit the household, but my husband and I got hit first before the kids, which in all of our years raising kids, we've never been hit at the same time. It's always been like a 12-hour window of one parent being sick, then that parent recovering, and the other one then getting sick. So it's always been, I guess, nice, if that's the way to put it, of having one person be on, because it's inevitable that the kids are going to be sick if they aren't already. So for me, it was unfortunate because my husband, who is a man, was down for the count, way worse than I was. But I also feel like that's partial mental for men, where any type of sickness is just at least 50% worse than it really is. But I will say I had to pull myself together because I did have to parent the kids while also being sick. My daughter stayed at home because she was complaining of a stomach ache. And lo and behold, at 5 p.m., she got sick, same thing. At that point, all of the kids were at home. So then I was trying to keep the germs away from the other kids while also trying to keep everything down and intact for myself. And so let's just say I couldn't wait until bedtime. So then I was like, okay, great. This is a 24-hour thing. We're going to be great. Wednesday's going to come around. We'll be able to record the podcast Wednesday or Thursday. And for whatever reason, I got sick with a respiratory illness right after that. And I felt miserable. So finally, Pete, on Friday, I went back to the doctor. Same location, different doctor. I'm on another steroid and an antibiotic, and I think that I finally turned the corner. Although I still have a cough, so I apologize if I sound more manly.
You sound good. You sound good.
I sound throaty, I think.
I would, if you didn't tell me that, I wouldn't have thought about it. But
so
I thought
can't remember, Pete. So we recorded 2 Tuesdays ago, and then the press conference was Wednesday. Right?
Yeah. So we got the hiring. The press conference came the day after.
Okay. I was like, it feels like
it's been a while.
The press conference was like a month ago.
Yes. So it went fast, but it had to be the longest press conference in Browns history.
I had to go back and look at my notes from what I was texting you just to remind myself. And then I was like, oh yes, I remember what was discussed.
Jim Schwartz gave the ultimate. He played to every possible Cleveland base you could have. He talked to olds, which most of the media is made up of, and they ate it up endlessly. That he talked about the 90s, which just, the 90s were so wonderful. I remember that. I was probably in my 30s. Most of these people were thinking to themselves. So you got a lot of that. You got some stories, which, they were entertaining.
The couch story.
You got.
We still don't have closure on that, by the way.
That's true. I am still waiting for the end of that anecdote. He explained that he got he with the help of somebody in the Browns organization, he got a used couch or a pre-owned couch for practically nothing. But we never heard what happened to what happened to the couch. We also heard apparently the famous sandwich story, which is fine. It's not, wasn't like this wonderful story that he basically stole Bill Belichick's sandwich parts unknowingly. And then he, I think it was like 14 minutes into the press conference, he finally got a question about, the Browns and now, and he immediately started by talking about his thyroid.
I was going to say, we also got his medical history.
Yes. Like, why were you out of the, why were you sort of in this consulting role with the Titans and all this other stuff? And, what do you like about this job and all this? And it's like, well, my thyroid. And it's just like, that's spectacular. Yeah.
You know what, Pete, I was thinking as he was going through his history, his medical history and the thyroid specifically, I was like, this is just setting up for if there's any issues in the near term with the Browns.
Laying groundwork.
Yes, exactly. Just laying the foundation of the thyroid being an issue and potentially flaring up again.
There's a lot of good stuff in the press conference that he talked about. The biggest thing, there were a couple things that stood out to me. One of them was really interesting because at the time I ignored it. I frankly thought it was a non-answer, but Bree and I will sort of text each other about various things as they're happening to sort of like get a feel for where we're at or just whatever. And so he talked about how he made this big point about saying this is Kevin Stefanski's staff. And at the time, my immediate reaction was, that's difference. That's just, he's trying to make sure that it doesn't come off like, because there are a lot of people who want this to be Jim Schwartz, effectively the head coach in waiting for when Kevin Stefanski inevitably screws up, as if any organization operates that way. Because if that was really what they were thinking, they should have just fired him. Honestly, I mean, if they were going, well, if he screws up, Jim Schwartz can step in and be the head coach. That's stupid. If that's really how they felt, move on. It does us no good. But he talked about, he then went on to talk about like all the different places he's worked and like how the different ways he's sort of operated. Like two jobs, he was basically the last guy hired as the defensive coordinator. He talked about how he was like the last guy hired for the Philadelphia Eagles when they won the Super Bowl. I think he was one of the last guys hired with the Buffalo Bills. And then he's talked about other situations where he has had a ton of input on assistant coaches. And at the time you're sitting there going, well, of course he's essentially the first guy hired. Clearly they obviously haven't done anything, even though at the time I thought was, as I'm hearing him talk, well, this continues to make me think that he's probably going to keep Jason Tarver around just because I think Jason Tarver did a really good job with linebackers coach. And if you listen to him sort of talk about coaches, he made a big point about how like players are a big factor in this and like how they respond and stuff. And so you're easily going, well, he got a lot out of sort of a leanly invested in linebacker room who then had to keep plugging in guys over and over and over again, and they did okay. And you're sitting there going, okay, I can sort of understand that. But here we are 2 weeks later. We've sort of got some reports that suggest some jobs are safe, but really haven't any names attached. And I don't think we're going to really find anything until the Browns just either one, announce somebody has been fired, which they haven't done to this point, or two, announce this is our staff for 2023. And at some point that's going to happen, but that has not happened to this point. And so one of the things Bree sort of opined about, or just sort of her immediate reaction, is the one that I think is probably going to end up being the right one. So by all means, go ahead.
Well, I thought I had a couple. So
fair enough.
I
you
thought
had more than one thing right.
I did. Well, I don't know. At first, I liked the fact that, again, he obviously comes with a lot of experience, but he didn't seem to have an ego. which seems to be a pretty common theme amongst at least the head coach, as well as Andrew Barry as the general manager. As you said, he talked about how it was Kevin Stefanski's team and he has the say in who the staff is and building the staff, with what he wants and how he wants to structure the team. He also talked a lot about consistency. But for me, I think the biggest kind of unlock, or what I appreciated the most, was just how he talked about the most important thing in his job is really earning the players' trust and building that trust in order to garner the respect. To me, that kind of just spoke to maybe the narrative regarding the culture challenges that the defense specifically has had, and the breakdowns and communication and all of that stuff. So I liked that. I liked that a lot. And he also talked, which obviously I can relate to, about coaching is really just like being a parent. A lot of what you do as a coach, it felt like he alluded to, I don't need to yell and scream, right?
He made a specific point to undermine his own, this is a whole big thing. All these people were like, oh yeah, we got a fiery coach. He made a point to literally undercut that and say, I've learned not to, and that has made me a better coach.
Yeah. And to go off of that, as a parent, I have learned a lot in how my kids respond and how my kids react to certain situations, because they learn from how you act and behave. You are modeling behavior for your children every day as a parent. It's really no different in coaching. The team that you are coaching, they kind of take on that same personality. And I know that fans could argue that, well, that's why they don't like Kevin Stefanski, because he is very calm-natured and even-keeled. And I think, as you said, they're thinking that Jim Schwartz is going to come in and be that fiery guy. But he talks a lot about how, no, I don't think that players really respond to that. They respond by earning their trust, making them better. They truly just want to get better. And if you can help them get better and be at the top of their game, then they're going to respect you and then they're going to listen to you. You don't need to do that by yelling. So Pete, that was really my biggest thing about him. I'm still waiting for that follow-up about his thyroid. I'm wondering when he's going to first be back in the in the media eye again, if anyone's going to follow up about his thyroid. I think there's way more that we didn't uncover there.
Right. But the other thing you sort of touched on when it came specifically to hiring and him being a defensive coordinator is the thing, and stood out to me, said he doesn't care. As in, it's not a big deal to him. If you want him to hire coaches, he can hire coaches. If you don't, it just doesn't seem to be a major factor. And that may prove to be exactly what has happened. Like I said, we don't know who's ultimately going to be on the staff, but, and right now, the Senior Bowl has just started. This was the first day of practice and all that, but the Senior Bowl is one of the biggest job fairs, the unofficial job fair of the NFL. There are all kinds of coaches down there. I have literally seen a guy hired by the Steelers on the sideline at a practice. There's a lot that goes on there with that. So it's possible that the Browns are sort of looking into more options down there as we speak, in addition to all the things that they might be doing, in terms of scouting and stuff. So maybe that will change. But at least right now, I'm inclined to think that Breeze sort of hit the nail on the head, and it's just not a big deal, and that we may end up with a lot of the same names. Now, that's interesting to me because it sort of hits on the thing that I really took away from his press conference, because this is a really important skill, is coaching coaches.
Yes. I was hoping you'd bring that up.
To me, if the Browns were to keep, most of the defensive staff, that, including guys like Chris Kiffin, who was, some theorized, thought he was out the door, and that's why he was willing to talk about the whole Jadeveon Clowney situation. That press conference was thinking, oh, I can, I'm probably not going to be here in 15 minutes. I might as well say my piece and sort of defend myself. Or, Jeff Howard, who did interview for another job, but I don't think we've heard anything about that. So who knows? That would suggest that the Browns liked those coaches, but thought Joe Woods did not do a good job of coaching his coaches, which is to say that he did not communicate effectively what he wanted them to be able to do.
Yeah.
And Jim Schwartz hammered this point home, which is really, really important, and talked about how it took him years and years and years to sort of figure out how to do it. I would say that Kevin Stefanski has done a really good job on the offensive side of the ball.
Yes.
Coaching coaches. Certainly, it probably doesn't take much to get Bill Callahan to do a good job at what he does, but that still involves making sure that everybody's on the same page and they're getting the things done they need to get done. But they've also had some young guys step up, and you've had, like, Drew Petzing was the tight ends coach who became the quarterbacks coach. The quarterbacks, performed pretty well this year. We saw Jacoby Brissett play really, really well. That would suggest that the coaching coming from Stefanski and by extension Alex Van Pelt is effectively teaching those guys or coaching those guys on what needs to happen. I think, this is not something that's been talked a whole lot about, and including myself. I hadn't really thought about it because we just don't know enough information, but it would suggest that Joe Woods struggled in that department. And he wouldn't be the first guy who's failed as a result of that. But when you look at sort of how disjointed the defense was this year, it's not difficult to come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
Thinking about that. So I thought it was important that he hit on that. I liked him talking about that and sort of expounding on that. But you touched on some things that I think are important, which is if you know what you're talking about and you have the player's best interests at heart, they're going to listen to you. And not enough people get that. Again, there's so many people who view this through casting a movie role, or whatever their mind's eye thinks of what a defensive coordinator is supposed to look like, or how they're supposed to act, or a head coach, or whatever, that you can sort of get there. Now, Jim Schwartz, after sort of undermining and saying, he's not as fiery as he used to be, he still made sure to insist that he can still get it going if need be. But nevertheless, he, in a lot of ways, echoes a lot of what Kevin Stefanski has talked about as a head coach, being that sort of servant leader, being a guy who wants to empower people to do their job. So all of that was interesting to me. And then obviously he hit on the thing I wanted to hear the most about, which is, Jim Schwartz, a guy who's had a ton of success with defensive line, saying, pass rush, pass rush, pass rush, pass rush. He could just send that 10 times in a row. I'd have been, all right, we're good. But he just emphasized just how much he believes that can change the game. I think for a lot of people, that's music to their ears. He did sort of note that he's not really he likes to have the blitz at his disposal, but he doesn't want to live and die by it because it's just inherently unreliable. You want it as a tool, but his goal is to be able to get there with the front four or front whatever he's got to generate pressure so that everything else can sort of operate effectively, which is exactly what you want to have. One would hope that in saying all this, it's because he knows that he's been told, and the Browns have been stressing, no, we're going to get this right. We're going to give you the tools necessary, because if you don't, and they're sitting here next year in the position they were a lot of this year, it's going to invalidate the hire in the first place. And we're going to be sitting here, why did you bother to hire this guy if it's just Myles Garrett and three guys named Fred up front? Like it's going to be, and look, as we've talked about, there's only so many things they could do at this point. They've got three really talented corners. They've got at least one really talented safety. John Johnson is a giant question mark. I don't know where that's going to go. It's an interesting decision. And then the linebackers, which I'm sorry, I cannot stop laughing at this notion that we're asking, how big do you want your linebacker?
I was dying when he had to specify like the specific weight. But also happy that he clarified they don't need to be a certain weight to be a good linebacker.
No, and look, he did not coach. He was not the defensive coordinator for the Tennessee Titans, but he specifically pointed out their itty bitty linebacker, who's even like arguably smaller than JOK, kid out of West Virginia whose name escapes me right now, but he's really good and somebody I liked coming out of college, who's just runs around and does his job. And part of that is because he likes big defensive linemen. They're going to do enough damage up front that's going to allow those guys to thrive. All he really cares about, as he should, I want good linebackers.
Yeah.
That's all he's interested in. Other than pointing out, no defensive coordinator is going to come up and tell you that they're going to play slow, soft, and hesitant or whatever. They want to be fast, confident, and aggressive or whatever it was. Like, of course, those are all those things, but we get caught up. we let certain people who have no business setting a narrative set a narrative. Like this notion of linebackers need to be big came from one guy who happens to be leathery and orange, who has not liked JOK since the second he arrived, and has sort of allowed this to be a thing where we go, well, you've got to have these bigger linebackers. You know, there were people in Cleveland who were sitting there pounding the table for the Browns to take a 270-pound middle linebacker in 2021, who ended up getting drafted by the Arizona Cardinals, thank God. And the Browns ended up drafting Greg Newsome, and that 270-pound middle linebacker has done practically nothing for the Cardinals. It's impractical. You cannot play so big that now you're getting beat by smaller, faster teams. It's just not practical. You've got to find guys who are tough enough to do the job. And ultimately that's all that matters. Don't worry about how big they are. Just worry about, can they do the job? And look, there's all kinds of pressure on them to get this done, but, and a question to answer at middle linebacker right now. But the biggest thing I think that helps with Jim Schwartz is he carries himself like a guy who has done this over and over again. And I think that is helpful for a lot of people, both fans and media, this is sort of old hat to him, that he's just going, yeah, I've done this. Hey, we were really good all these times. We expect to be really good now. Let's just get it going and figure it out. So there, like I said, he hits on so many notes and so many of those things that people wanted to hear, and he's really good. It's a shame that, he has a reputation of suddenly becoming very tight-lipped as things get going. But he was certainly entertaining in talking about what he wants to do. Yeah,
he also touched on the analytics piece of it. At the very end, I think, is when that happened. Because
his career started in analytics. That's all he did for Bill Belichick. Like it's unbelievable that we're still like, we cannot help ourselves. And again, it's the same guy who taught, asked in the most condescending way possible too. Like,
yeah, well, I honestly thought he handled the question very well though. And for me, for the people that don't really understand analytics, I thought he explained it like in a very simple way to get people to maybe understand a bit more about how they utilize analytics. And I don't remember his exact quote, but it went along the lines of something like, it's just information, and that information is going to help us make decisions. It doesn't mean that we're only going to go the way that the analytics tell us, but it's essentially having information at the tip of your fingertips. And why would you not want to have information to help make decisions?
Look, as somebody who does this, and people can knock it at the high school level, so much of what we do is trying to get as much information as humanly possible, because it makes all the difference in the world.
But he also did touch on, which I can also relate to because my job heavily relies on analytics, is the analysis paralysis. Because when you do have a lot of information at your fingertips and you have all of these numbers or data or certain things, it can be overwhelming in a sense of like, you can get so hung up and caught up in the data that you almost like forget, like, okay, wait a minute, I got to take a step back here. Like, what is this actually telling me? How is this actually going to help me? Because you can get lost in those certain things. So I did like how he talked about that. Like, the reality is, it is a very fine balance of having both an analytical mindset and then also just going with your gut. Because, sometimes that is a piece of it too.
And he answered the question about accountability. And I totally understand why people are asking it. I do think people are expecting an answer that revolves more around punishment than what coaches really view accountability as, which I think is more important. Like for him, he goes, the secret sauce is getting guys to playing together and that accountability that goes into it. I would say this: if I'm doing a good job, we hold our best players the most accountable. And if you start from that position, everything else is gravy. And look, he hits on a lot of things that people wanted to hear. There's no doubt about it. But I think too many people think about this in terms of sticks rather than carrots. And I think for him, he's thinking more in terms of carrots, that he can say, look, he can go to Myles Garrett and say, look, you want to be defensive player of the year. I can help you get that little bit extra necessary to get there. I think he can say to guys like, these DBs in particular, look, you guys I've been really good at times while being wildly inconsistent at other times. Like, we can work together and get you that little bit that gets that consistency and you get to really where you want to be. I think he can challenge those guys to play at that level to then now naturally hold accountable the other guys, because the best case scenario, and we've talked about this before, is not to have coaches hold players accountable. It's to have players hold players accountable, because at that point, coaches can just focus on what they need to do. If the players are taking care of that, that's when you know you're a good team. And then his sort of money quote was, quote, "If I'm doing a good job here, we'll coach the undrafted free agents the same way we do the veteran players that's been to multiple Pro Bowls." And that's what you want. Now we'll see what happens when you get there. But like, as I said, I don't doubt that he's going to operate that way. I think toughness for him is just being consistent and demanding the most out of the best guys, which it will be interesting. Personally, I think that will bring the best out of Myles Garrett. I think Myles Garrett will respond to being challenged personally better than being challenged to get everybody else to do it. I think if he can sort of believe in the fact that they're going to hold the entire group accountable, which clearly was inconsistent this previous year, as illustrated by some of the stuff with Jadeveon Clowney and some other things, that's going to make it easier for him to feel like, I need to be at my best, but two, I don't feel like it's such an uphill battle to get guys to do what they need to do to be successful. So that's where they've got to do it, but I think that's where I think we can get this whole accountability notion headed in the wrong direction, where we think it's about punishment rather than getting on the same page, chasing after the same goals, all those things. What's it really take to be a good team? It doesn't take, just punishing people isn't going to get you to be a good football team. That's probably an indication that you've got more problems than anything. What you want is to have an accountable team, which is accountable because they're doing the things that they need to do to be successful.
Yeah. Well, Pete, the other big interview that happened when we were off last week that we didn't get to talk about was Kevin Stefanski was on the Ken Carman show.
He did. He was. We don't like to take credit here, but I think he listened to us, and that just
per usual.
That he is a good advocate for himself, and I think he does. I think he does a really good job in press conferences communicating, but the nature of a press conference is just a grab bag where you don't get a conversation. And
right.
Even though there's some, hokey questions sort of thrown in there along the way, in this interview, Ken Carman and Anthony Lima do a really good job of having a conversation with him. So, that grab bag thing can sort of have you be defensive because you feel like you're trying to deal with all these things, but also it just takes your train of thought away because you're trying to address one thing and maybe you're thinking about, topic A, but then you get asked about B, C, and D, and then you sort of lose the train of thought you had with A, where another question later might come back to it. And it just doesn't allow you to have that conversation. I think that worked really, really well for him. The thing that I like to hear from him is talking about why he is deliberately calm in how he operates.
Yes.
And talking about it. Look, if you're emotional, if you're angry, if you're all these other things, you can't think. And his whole job is to make decisions constantly. You have to be able to make decisions. I think it's easy to argue that there are times when coaches do dumb shit because they're so angry that they cannot think anymore. And we see this like both college and pro, where, you ask, or really any level, you see coaches who demand their players be disciplined, they be accountable, all this other thing. And then they don't get their way and they throw an intergalactic hissy fit where they throw the headset, they're smashing stuff or whatever. And then they'll turn around and yell at a player who gets a 15-yard penalty for doing the same thing on the field. Like,
that goes back to what Jim Schwartz was talking about. And
right.
It's very similar to parenting. Like, the way that you act is how your players ultimately will act.
Instead of giving players an excuse to act like idiots or anything else, he acts the way he wants them to focus on. And obviously football is an emotional game, as most sports are. And, you get heated on the field, but ultimately the way he wants to sort of set the tone is next play mentality. Something goes wrong, fine, move on to the next one. And a lot of people preach that. Hell, the place I coach, we preach that. Next play mentality. You got to be able to move on, have a short memory, focus on what's coming up next. Because some of that stuff, you if you're in an argument with the official, the game's still going. You may have to like get a play call or make a decision in there, and the clock is running. The other team's doing what they're ever going to do. You can't sit there and just dwell. It hurts you. So having somebody who says specifically, I want to do this so I can think clearly and make the best decisions I can for my team is smart. So people will like bag on him and go, he's holding his Denny's menu, even though I don't think there's a thing in a Denny's that's on his diet. I have to think there'd be something, some fancier place he could get a menu from. And I do think this is a sponsorship opportunity for any number of places to go around and start sponsoring various play sheets around the league. But he's doing that because he's focusing on the next decision, and people don't like it because it doesn't look very good. It looks like he's not,
he doesn't
interested
care.
Or not, he's stoic and aloof in the moment, but he's focusing on what he needs to do, which is making the next decision. I think him explaining that is probably helpful for some people. Again, I think this is one of those things where there are people who are just always going to look at him and think I want my coach to act a certain way, when his focus is only on the 53 guys in the locker room, the 46 guys active on game day, and what is going to be best for them. And what's going to be best for them is being in a position to make the best decisions possible. And the contrast I'd make, and I cannot say for sure that Dan Campbell has lost football games because he's losing his mind on the sideline, but I can point to games where there's questionable decisions made at the end of the game. And I sit there wondering how much of that is a product of being exhausted from losing your mind so much during the game. And it's tiring to do that over the course of the game. So I thought that part was important. I thought that part was interesting. It was interesting because the way it was asked, Ken Carman asked the question. He specifically noted that as a player, Kevin Stefanski was an emotional guy, which, I can't say I watched his pen tape to know what he was like, but that's an interesting note that he was a fiery player, and he specifically made the choice to be a more clear-headed coach.
I would agree wholeheartedly. I actually think having him be on a show like that outside of a press conference situation and scenario allowed him to explain himself a little bit better and his thought process and address some of those concerns that constantly come up from just a fan base perspective. And I'm sure he doesn't really listen to radio or read or peruse Twitter and the Reddit board. I find that very hard to believe. But it was nice to hear from him just in a more normalized conversation and get a little bit more out of him, because he isn't very revealing when it comes to press conferences, or even, he does that weekly show during the season. But again, you can tell he's just very focused on doing his job and focusing in on the game plan ahead, that getting him in an off-season situation and hearing some of his thoughts and how he operates and what he thinks and where his mindset is, I think humanizes him a little bit more. I do.
Charms his critics.
Exactly.
So
because
easily.
He can come off very robotic or going through the motions, that it's nice to have the humanizing element from him as well.
Anthony Lima does not like Kevin Stefanski very much. And I wouldn't surprise me if Lima was inclined to say, could you sign this for me? And then him quickly add, can you sign it, Mike Vrabel? But even him, like in that interview, like he couldn't help himself, but sort of like be, sort of charmed by Kevin Stefanski. I do think being in studio is helpful, not being on the phone, but like, I saw certain people in the media who couldn't get enough of avid endorsement, even though this is a line he's used before.
Oh yeah. That was my favorite thing when he started or when he was hired as the head coach. That was one of the things he said in his press conference. And funny thing, Pete, when he said that, I was like, I've never related to something more in my life, because like I am 100% an avid indoorsman as well. Like my favorite thing in the world is not leaving the house on the weekends. And he said the same thing again. And I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot about this line. So I tweeted about it again. lo and behold, I had tweeted that exact same thing like 3 years ago from him saying it. So he is consistent.
Yes. Well, he also he's got that. He and Andrew Berry clearly have what I would call dad jokes, just jokes they tell each other a whole lot.
Yes.
Like when he's like,
I'm going to have to ask Britton all of Andrew's dad jokes.
Well, like Kevin Stefanski at one point when Andrew Berry was trying to relay a quote from Kevin Stefanski, and he goes, "Pretty good for government work." I guarantee that comes up a whole lot. Like those just type of things are like, I expect they get pretty corny after a while, but they're just, they're bestest buddies at this point. So it's just
on the same page.
But yeah, it was definitely interesting. Now, the other thing that him talking about Deshaun Watson, and I wish they would have done more with this, and if he comes on the show, he can get more. To me, it was clear that scramble drill is front of his mind, and just how much that is going to change what this offense looks like. And he even said flat out, like, we've talked about it, but it's different trying to do it. And, at one point I mentioned this, and even Nate Zagura sort of chimed in on a tweet I had just saying like, yeah, we've talked about this too. It's going to be huge. Like I basically said, if the Browns spend like 2 months just doing nothing but scramble drill, it will be a massive investment in the right type of thing. And we've seen this, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the playoffs, particularly Patrick Mahomes with Joe Burrow and some of these other guys, when the plays break down and things happen, that they have a good feel of where they are. And the Browns did not. And some of those guys have never really done it. I mean, the most famous play is obviously Michael Woods sort of turning his body the wrong way, not being able to anticipate where Deshaun Watson was sort of wanting him to go. But that is such a big part of who Deshaun Watson was with the Houston Texans, that with a full off season, working with those guys, and I suspect this will be a big part of, if they organize a trip or do whatever, retreat,
Aruba. Where did they go? Bahamas?
Yeah, they went to the Bahamas last year. That's a major part of it, is just focusing on getting that chemistry and getting a feel for where Deshaun can go, where it's going to work for receivers to go, and those type of things. So when plays break down, they've got several very talented football players who can find space, get open, and make plays. And we saw this a little bit. I think the best example, the scramble, the most successful. I mean, Kevin Stefanski at his point goes, I don't remember a single play made out of scramble drill. Now, the one I would point to is where Deshaun Watson found Nick Chubb in the end zone against the Steelers, where you got that little bit where, he attacks forward, pulls the defender away from Chubb and just dumps it over his head, like those little things. But I think we're going to see a whole lot more of that, and it's going to make this offense more efficient and more successful, offer opportunities to make bigger plays. And this was a question. The reason I think this is front of mind is this was a question about taking sacks. And like I said, and it was, to me, I think it's just, he's chomping at the bit to be able to work on that, because I think he understands how much that is going to change what they're going to do in this coming season, and why he's so excited. And like, as I've said before, all these people talk about, there's all kinds of pressure on Kevin Stefanski. And I 100% get that, but I have to think that he is giddy, because this is the dream scenario he has for himself, where he's got the quarterback he wants. He's got all these weapons. He's got everything on offense trending in a way that's going to be great for him. And now he got to hire Jim Schwartz. He got to hire all these things that are sort of set up the way he wanted. And it may be pressure and they may have to win, but ultimately he couldn't have asked for a better scenario for himself.
Yeah. And I would also say that was clearly one of the things that the team struggled with Deshaun coming back into the offense at the end of the season, was just there. I don't want to say inability, but it was just ineffective with his scrambling. So like, to your point of having that be like a really big focus for the offseason, actually having time to practice and just get the team more familiar with that, I think is going to be a huge benefit. I mean, listen, I think there's a lot to look forward to. I hate to say that, because I told you I'm guarded. I'm being very guarded. And I also said that like Sunday for me was like the peak of my seasonal football depression, because
this is interesting. You and I have the exact opposite end of the spectrum on this. And it's really
okay. Well, please tell me. No, please tell me what your thoughts were.
I love the playoffs between all three rounds are great leading up to the Super Bowl. And the reason is because for 6-10 weeks, I'm hearing how it's the end of the world and everything's wrong with the Browns, and the playoffs start. And as these teams lose, there are a couple where everybody's like, oh, Jacksonville will be back. They'll be in great shape. They're going to be looking forward to, they can't wait for next year. It's going to be awesome. Then the Dallas Cowboys lose. And it is full on meltdown. The Buffalo Bills lose. Yeah. I don't know how many shots we're going to have at this. Oh man, we blew a big one this one. Or, some of these other
teams. You enjoy the demise of the fan bases as their teams fall.
I do, but I also think it's
you
so
are
much
a sick
of it
person,
is like,
Pete.
I think also it's just so much of it is like we're back to a level playing field. We're like the Super Bowl is here, and now there's 30 pleb teams, as opposed to we're all sitting here going, well, my team's in the playoffs. We're so much better than you, or we finished with a better record. And now you get the playoffs, and all these teams are hugely disappointed. Everything went wrong, and all of a sudden, we just blew our best shot. And everybody is the Browns for a week, or whatever it is, where you're just sitting there tearing themselves apart. And look, they'll all get to a point. They will all talk. Look, Dallas will find the strength to tell us for 11 months, and obviously every 4-letter network will talk about the Cowboys ad nauseum and how they're back and everything else. But for that little window of time, you're sitting there going, I don't know. This looks really bad. It's just everybody's on the same page, and it feels so good, including the fact that I did not want to see the Bengals go to the Super Bowl again. I did not. And all these people are like, yeah, it's, Joe Burrow. How can you not like him? It's very easy. It's very easy for me. He plays for the Bengals. I don't want them to be good. Listen, I am full of spite when it comes to this stuff. Give me 20 minutes. I'll find a way to hate a team. In coaching, we played a team that had the audacity to think they could compete with us this year. I hate that team. They've never beaten us since we've coached there. And I just want to destroy them. I like Joe Burrow fine. He's a nice guy. He's a very talented quarterback. I'm not going to take anything away from him. It never helps when media gets involved and they just cannot stop puffing and puffing and puffing and telling everybody how he's the greatest parts of Joe Montana and Tom Brady all in one. Mm-hmm. So, and none of that is his fault.
No, that's the thing. That's the thing. And for some reason, my TikTok algorithm is Harry Styles, obviously. Joe Burrow has somehow weaseled his way into my algorithm, and I have no idea why, mixed with a little bit of the Idaho murders. So like, that's like what I'm seeing like day in and day out. And, a lot of women like Joe Burrow because of his looks. Like, I think he has that broad appeal. That's actually not me. He's cute, whatever. But like, I actually like him because he seems just very nerdy and humble, and his play backs it up. So like, that's where I'm just like, he's a very likable player in a sense that he doesn't talk. Like, he talks, but he's just very humble.
He walks a very fine line.
He does, because he also will post himself with cigars celebrating, right?
Very confident.
Very confident. He's got the swagger.
Yes,
I'm gonna say this, and I think that's like what I wanted Baker Mayfield to be, because Baker Mayfield also had like swagger, and he didn't run away from controversy. He was okay to stir the pot. He was okay to like go after media. He was okay to celebrate, and like that's actually what I loved about Baker Mayfield. His play just didn't always back it up. So that's where I like really struggled with, with Baker. But like, that's why I think I see myself like seeing Joe Burrow as likable, because they have some very similar personality tendencies, if you will. Although I do think Joe's a little bit more humble than Baker.
More humble, more mature. But I think the thing you're
agreed.
hitting on that's really important and is absolutely true, as opposed to someone like Lamar Jackson, and it's this not to denigrate Lamar Jackson, but I think what is endearing about Baker Mayfield and Joe Burrow, they ooze wanting to be great in Cleveland and Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Like, there is never a hint of Joe Burrow as anything but fully committed to being the Bengals quarterback for a very, very long time. If you're a fan of that team and the Browns, who haven't had a ton of success, who have in a lot of ways, particularly Cleveland, and this goes beyond football, having a little bit of an inferiority complex,
Yes,
where we
agreed.
see cities like New York and LA and all these things, and they get these superstars, and there's this feeling like, well, they take them for granted.
Yes.
If only we had that star, we would treasure them forever, even though LeBron James would argue differently.
Right.
And football is just a different deal. But those guys, and whatever you want to say about Baker Mayfield, and he didn't work, he desperately wanted to be the hero for
Yes.
this franchise. And
Very
when he was
loyal.
good and when they were winning, it was people like just ran to him because he just wanted everybody to be able to enjoy when they made the playoffs. He wanted them to be able to enjoy
Yes.
beating the Steelers and that. And he just had so much fun at that time. And Joe Burrow, to your point, he is more humble. He's a little bit more reserved in how he does it, but he makes sure to have fun. And
Yes.
it's very easy to sort of be like, I guess jealous, maybe jealous.
Yes.
But just be able to be like, I totally understand why.
Yes.
Even though Bengals fans can be can get a little haughty at times.
Yes, they are more annoying than Joe Burrow himself, and like obviously Brown's Twitter was like very divided on the whole thing because there were fans of the Browns that were like, I don't understand how you could ever root for a division rival, and like I don't care that they're in Ohio, and I don't care about Joe Burrow and he's a hometown kid, blah blah blah. There was like it was very divisive on Twitter of, your loyalties and how dare you and all this stuff. And I didn't like the fact of, the mayor coming out and saying all that stuff before the game. Like, I'm actually okay with the player to player stuff, Pete. Like, give me all of that drama. Like, that's fun. Like, that makes it fun.
Burrowhead Stadium.
The whole Burrow. I mean, Joe Burrow wasn't saying that. Like,
no, it was Mike Hilton who played awful in that game.
Yes. So, but I'm okay, like, with the fire and the fight and the smack talking on the internet publicly and the jarring, because I like those storylines. I think it makes for really fun discussions. And do I think that the players like use it as fuel? Maybe not. Like, the reality is they don't need that additional fuel either. Like, they're playing in one of the most important games, but clearly Travis Kelce brought it all up at the end of the game. Sure. So it was something that was talked about and what they discussed. And I don't know, like, but I am all for that. I am all for that. I think what's funny to me is the fan reaction to all of it, because I was seeing how a lot of people were mad, Browns fans specifically were mad at like how cocky the Bengals were about this whole thing.
And they were.
And all of these things. But I'm sitting here thinking, like, this is coming from the same fan base who a year ago, or like this past year, talked shit all the way up until we played Cincinnati for the second time, talking about how Joe Burrow's never beaten the Cleveland Browns. And I'm like, they're literally doing the same shit that we did. So please make that make sense for me.
Okay. So you're 100% right. I have no, I can't argue a single thing you said, because that's absolutely true.
Pete, let me remind you that last year, there were a portion of Browns Twitter celebrating the fact that Joe Burrow had never beaten the Cleveland Browns while he was playing in the Super Bowl. I'm like, guys, I think he's going to be okay. He's in the Super Bowl.
I would be lying if I said I didn't think that Joe Burrow looked like he was facing the Browns a little bit this past game. You and I are of a similar age, and I think some of that enjoying the player-to-player trash talk is a product of the 90s and 2000s NBA.
Yes.
I hated Michael Jordan. I hated him as a player growing up, because what did he do? He talked a lot of shit and destroyed my dreams.
Yes.
Like, just reaped souls of childhood. And I could not stand the six champions. Just go away. Just go away.
Right.
But like, he was everything that like you're applauding right now. And it was, you look back and you go, oh, that was so much fun. Like, that was just added. Obviously, the NBA is different because he's literally going against guys on the other team, or he's defending them, which football doesn't have. I mean, like, everybody wants to make this, Burrow versus Mahomes. They're never on the field at the same time. So it's always lose a little bit. But it did get to a point where the Chiefs and the Bengals just hated each other. They hated each other.
Yes.
The amount of like just frustration. You mentioned Kelsey. He was hardly the only one. Chris Jones talking about Arrowhead Field, and they had to add in the parentheses the was a GEHA field at Arrowhead for the sake of sponsorships and all that. And just like that stuff's fun. And I do think it takes you back to a different time in the NBA where teams, one, they stayed together longer and hated each other. And we got a little bit of that with the Cavs and the Warriors, where just the teams just could not stand each other. But even then,
I mean, remember that was like the LeBron and Klay Thompson thing, and like the post game pressers. I mean, that's fun.
So like, I totally get it, and like, yeah, absolutely. I think once you get to spouses and elected officials, you get to this point where it gets very weird and cringy real fast. But no, like now, what does everybody want to see now? They want to see the Chiefs and the Bengals play again next year. In the same way that we wanted to see the Chiefs and the Bills a couple of years ago. And who knows how long this will last. So you sort of treasure. That's the other part that makes it difficult is the NBA has playoff series that tend to run into each other quite a bit. So it can make things interesting. But yeah, trust me, I appreciate how good Joe Burrow is, while I secretly hate him because he's on the team that's not mine. So in the same way that like, I sort of embraced the idea that everybody who wasn't a Browns fan hated Baker Mayfield with a passion because he was a dick, but he was our dick. And that was the thing, like where you sort of go, okay, I get it, but he's ours. So it's like, it made it fun. And, we'll see what happens with this team. I don't expect the Browns are going to get quite that chesty, especially with the people they have in place. But yeah, there's no question that was fun. But that sort of leads us into what we saw in the playoffs. And here again, we've got 2 rounds we can talk about, but obviously most of the stuff's could be the AFC and NFC championship. And here again, the biggest takeaway for me, defensive line, and the line of scrimmage in general. 49ers see Brock Purdy basically blow out his wrist, ruptured or whatever his UCL, 6-month potential recovery time, and the game was immediately over. It was just because the Eagles had so many pass rushers that based on the play action concept that they ran, that it asked their tight end to try to block, one of the best pass rushers in football this year. And it just didn't work. Now I would criticize Kyle Shanahan because he's got a track record of getting guys hurt, even though I've heard guys like Mitchell Schwartz and Joe Thomas defend this and go, no, this is a good play call. Joe Thomas loves Kyle Shanahan. But I think where you can criticize and go, this is a problem, is when you're going, okay, I understand why you're doing these things, but the guy in that moment, you have to go, can I protect this? And if I can't protect this and my quarterback gets hurt, now what happens? And they had no other options. And that's unfortunately too often the case. And I think it's fair to at least question why Kyle Shanahan basically averages a major quarterback injury about every 8 weeks. When it works, it's great. Kyle Shanahan is second to none in terms of being able to draw up offense and be able to scheme guys open and take advantage of run blocking and all these other things, angles, angles, boundary, all that type of stuff. But I think at times he risks too much and allows himself to be put in this position, which is why Jimmy Garoppolo is on his third career season-ending injury, which is what allowed Trey Lance to be injured this year, running QB power after giving up 3 first-round picks for this guy. It's troubling, but the bottom line is whether the Browns are very, very good offensive line-wise. And, I think the 2 games you watched, whether it was the 49ers losing their quarterback to injury or watching the poor Cincinnati Bengals offensive line just get gashed over and over and over again, you're sitting there going, okay, the Browns aren't perfect, but they're in pretty good shape there. But meanwhile, you're sitting there going, I want all the pass rushers. I want my defense to do that to the other team, where you're sitting there going, I just want to hurt. Hurt's a strong word, kill's a stronger word, but I want to make life hell for the opposing quarterback as often as I can, because every time we get to the playoffs, it's the biggest determining factor in who's going to win these games.
100%. And I think too, just watching these games and these teams specifically, you have to have a solid defense. I know the offense is really important and obviously you need to score points, but to me, like what jumped out on paper is just having that consistent and solid defense to be able to make plays, to be able to get off the field. I mean, obviously these are very talented quarterbacks that are playing at these high levels, but I step back and I look at the defense, getting to the quarterback, like you mentioned, and getting off the field on third down and holding teams to field goals, or, having them have to make decisions of going forward on fourth down. And so I do think that the offense in the NFL has been a very big focus for the last few years, specifically the passing game. That's obviously changing, not changing. The passing game isn't changing, but I think these teams get smarter. You're seeing these defenses being obviously more apt to deal with those explosive offenses and being able to have answers. So that's what jumped out at me over the last couple of weekends.
You mentioned it, fourth down. Again, hugely important in these the championship games. You saw teams convert, or at least theoretically convert. In the case of the Eagles, big
shouldn't
play.
Have.
Yeah, I mean, just fourth and 3, 4th and 6, 4th and 5. Those are all situations that were huge plays in that game. And what did we see consistently? Aggressive teams going for it, and the team that ultimately sort of, Andy Reid sort of toned it down to the end, and I thought he actually put himself in a bad situation when he chose to punt from like the Bengals 38, I think it was. That was like a Pat Shurmur punt. But ultimately they did hold and were able to win, in part because they got a big special teams play and they got the big penalty and all that. But it just continues to pay off to be aggressive, and the teams that tend to turtle up don't do well. And it's a shame that the NFC Championship game was sort of decided by the injury, because Kyle Shanahan is a guy who typically becomes very, very conservative in the playoffs. And I would have been curious to see how that would have gone, because the Eagles are very aggressive, just continuing to see how that decision-making going. And as I've said before, I think Brandon Staley got browbeaten into being the coach that all these people wanted him to be, and they lost for it, as opposed to continuing to stick with who he was. I'll be curious to see if he sort of goes back to being that more aggressive style coach next year, since he's gotten a reprieve. He's keeping that job, and all things are full steam ahead with the Chargers. But having a guy like Kevin Stefanski who's sticking to his guns and very confident in that, I think is going to pay off handsomely for the Browns on that end. Ultimately, everything's depend on the quarterback and where that goes. But I do think you're seeing it over and over and over again, how that aggressive mentality is just so important. And in particularly in the AFC Championship game, every field goal felt like a failure. Every field goal felt like just a hugely deflating moment for the team that had to make the kick, because the Chiefs had full control in that first half, and they kept having to kick field goals, and you felt like you went to halftime. I think it was 13-3, and you're sitting there going, the Chiefs are okay spot, or maybe
it didn't feel like enough.
Yeah, it may have been 13-6 or whatever. But anyway, it just they had total control, and they just didn't get enough points. And there were so many games this year for the Browns where you had that feeling where you're sitting there going, they played better than the other team in the first half or whatever, but it just didn't feel like they got enough. The Buffalo Bills stands out big time, where the Bills were scuffling and the Browns just could not do enough with those opportunities. So it was just reinforces that idea of how important that is. And it's always interesting. I really enjoy the playoffs for that, just to contrast coaching styles and what some of the things that the teams are doing. The Bengals, I'm very curious to see what happens for them, because all of a sudden we've seen multiple head coaching hirings. Frank Reich hired by Carolina. That seems pretty good. DeMeco Ryans took the Houston job. Interesting. I'm glad he got a lot of years and guarantees. And then the incredibly strange situation with Denver, where seemingly their third first choice, maybe Sean Payton, in all those picks.
Yeah.
And Arizona's still hanging out there. Now that the Bengals assistants are suddenly available, I'm curious to see if a team goes hard after Lou Anarumo, because he has been nothing short of phenomenal as a defensive coordinator, and it would be really helpful. It'd be doing me a huge solid to get him out of the division. And I guess good for him to, if he wants to be a head coach too, but it would really help me out to get him out, because you look at the Bengals defense in some of those games, particularly like positions like corners, like how are they doing this? I don't understand how they're good. They've got talent, they've got some players, defensive line and safeties and stuff like that. But like, you're sitting there going, oh my God, like this defense should not be good. And it continues to be exceptional. And why can't we do that?
Yeah, exactly. I know. Maybe next year, Pete.
Well,
I guess it's technically this year.
that's going to be the question. Can Jim Schwartz deliver?
Yeah, that's what they hired him for.
Plenty to keep looking at. I like I said, the Browns are, full circle. The Browns are at the Senior Bowl like everybody else. Curious to see if we get any coaching decisions coming out of this week. Beyond that, the Senior Bowl itself is an interesting event. There's other All-Star games. Shrine game is going on this week. You saw the NFLPA game last week. The All-Star circuit is here. A couple weeks away from the end of February, we'll get the NFL Scouting Combine, which is going to be interesting for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is going to be when we start hearing rumors about things. I don't know if we're going to hear anything crazy or weird about the Browns, in terms of what they might try to pursue in this coming year in terms of players they might add, but that would be sort of where that stuff will heat up, and we'll get some of that stuff. But in the meantime, we've got 2 weeks, we'll have another show before the Super Bowl so we can talk about the Super Bowl and any predictions we have for that. But there's more to talk about in terms of the Browns. But other than that, keep doing the things, like, subscribe, all that stuff. YouTube, help us out on there. We'll be back next week. Hopefully Bree continues to have excellent health. And if so, we will be here.